We're going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about some of the different body cavities that are found in humans and about a process called homeostasis, which is a critical concept to understanding how the body functions. And it's a concept that we'll mention repeatedly in AMP 1 and 2. First things I want to talk about is a little bit about the different cavities of the body. Body cavities are simply regions of the body where different organs are housed. And there are two discretely different cavities of the body. There's what's called the dorsal cavity and there's the ventral cavity. Dorsal means posterior. Think of the dorsal fin on a shark and you'll be able to keep in mind that that means posterior. Ventral means anterior, basically. Now, the dorsal cavity has only really two major things to it: the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain and the spinal cord are housed respectively in the cranial cavity, that's where we find the brain, and the spinal cord is housed in the vertebral cavity or the vertebra. So the dorsal cavity is made up of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity contains the brain, the vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. And pretty much everything else is found in the ventral cavity. Now, we can divide the ventral cavity into three discrete regions. There is the thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity is basically all of the organs that are located superior to or above the diaphragm. The diaphragm is that sheet of muscle tissue right here that allows you to inhale, to pull air into your lungs. So everything above that black line I just drew there is the thoracic cavity. So that includes things like the lungs, the heart, your thymus, the esophagus, all of that, all of those internal organs. Thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, your larynx, all that good stuff is in the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm, or inferior to the diaphragm, is the second cavity of the ventral cavity, and that's called the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity is where you find the majority of your digestive organs, things like the liver and the pancreas, the stomach, the intestines, the gallbladder. You also find things in there like, the spleen, for example. Those are all housed in the ventral cavity. Lastly is the pelvic cavity, and this cavity, there isn't a line of demarcation like there was between the thoracic and abdominal cavity. Rather, it's sort of defined by the margin of the upper part of your hip bone, which we'll learn about next semester. But kind of where the upper part of your hip bone ends, that's kind of the line of demarcation, and everything below it more or less is considered to be part of the pelvic cavity. So this is where you find some of the reproductive organs, for example, and the bladder, etc. That's called the pelvic cavity. Now, very quickly, I want to introduce you to the different organ systems in the body, and I'm only going to do this briefly, but the whole point of Bio 201 and 202 is going to be to take you through an examination of each of these organ systems and some of the major functions that occur in each of them. So let me just give you a very brief overview. The integumentary system is a system that includes your epidermis and your dermis, and it's the largest organ in your body, your skin is, and it's responsible for all kinds of things like protection, secretion, absorption, etc. Your skeletal organ system is all of your bones, ligaments, and tendons, and it's there for support and protection. Your muscular system allows you to move in your environment. Remember, muscular tissue is composed of cells that have the ability to respond to a stimulus by contracting. The nervous system is that portion of your it's that organ system in your body that's responsible for detecting changes in the environment and relaying that information to different organs such as muscle tissue so that you can respond to those changes in your environment. The endocrine system is all about the manufacture of hormones, and hormones are messenger molecules that are sent from one organ to another organ to carry out a particular function. The cardiovascular system, of course, is your heart and blood vessels. They're responsible for circulating the blood, which delivers oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and also picks up metabolic waste products like carbon dioxide and urea, uric acid, etc. The immune system is composed of those cells and structures which are critical for helping you fight off invasion by foreign organisms such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, allergens, etc. The urinary system is responsible for filtering out metabolic waste products from the blood that have been picked up by the blood cells from your tissues, and the urinary system basically filters out those nitrogenous waste products from the blood and forms urine with them to release them from the body. The digestive system, of course, is what is the mechanism or organ system by which we are able to acquire nutrients from the food we ingest. The respiratory system assists us in the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs and introduces the oxygen into the blood and removes carbon dioxide from the blood and exhales it out of the body. And lastly, the reproductive system allows us to pass our genes on to offspring and future generations. Now, a very critical topic we need to talk about that we return to time and time again in the study of anatomy and physiology is this concept called homeostasis. Your body has an internal set point for its temperature. You have an internal set point for what the pH of your blood is. You have an internal set point for how rapidly you digest food, for how many times you take a breath each minute, for how many times your heart beats, etc. Your body will go to tremendous lengths to maintain those internal set points. So, for example, let's take body temperature. If your body temperature is 98.6 and your body suddenly starts getting very hot because you're exercising, your body is going to try to do something to correct the increase in body temperature to bring it back down to 98.6. Now, the way by which we do that, we bring things back down to the homeostatic set point, is usually through a mechanism called a negative feedback loop. And we see these time and time and time again. I'm going to give you an example using body temperature since that's what we started out talking about. In this case, imagine that body temperature, your normal body temperature here gets tweaked. Now in Celsius terms, body temperature, normal average human body temperature is 37 degrees. Just like in Fahrenheit it's 98.6. Now one thing I want to point out here is just because the average body temperature, normal body temperature is 98.6 does not mean that you are 98.6. You may never be 98.6. Okay, some people always have a body temperature that's slightly lower than 98.6. Other people have a set point or internal body temperature that's slightly above 98.6. But when we take the average of many different people in the human population, the average value of all of those individuals is about 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. So let's imagine that you're at normal body temperature. You're at 37 degrees Celsius and you suddenly get warm. Okay, let's say you're working out. That's your stimulus. You go for a run. There are a number of sensory cells in your body that will notice that rise in body temperature, and they will send that information to the brain. And the brain compares those pieces of information against the fact that your body temperature should be right around 37 degrees. And if it's not 37 degrees, we need to do something to lower it. Okay, so the brain will send out signals to the body. It will tell, for example, the sweat glands to start sweating so that we get the evaporative cooling effect of water exiting from the surface of the skin. And it will also tell blood vessels near the surface of your skin to begin dilating. And when they dilate or open up and get larger, that means more blood is flowing near the surface of the skin, which means we can dissipate the heat from the blood into the surrounding environment. And through these two effects, we are able to cool the body off and bring it back down to normal body temperature. We call this a negative feedback loop because the problem state and the solution state are opposite of one another. Okay, the problem state was we were getting too hot. The solution is to do the opposite, do something to cool off. Now let's take the reverse example. Let's say your normal body temperature, 37 degrees, starts to dip. Let's say you're going out in the winter time to walk the dog or whatever, and it's really cold out and your body temperature starts to drop. Again, you have neurons whose job it is to sense the change in body temperature and signal the brain to tell the brain, hey, the body temperature is dropping here. And the brain then sends out information to places like the blood vessels and sweat glands and the muscle tissue too, to tell them to do some things to help generate some heat for the body. For example, it tells the blood vessels near the surface of the skin to now constrict. And when they constrict, that means that less blood is flowing near the surface of the skin. That means less heat is lost to the environment. Of course, the sweat glands are told to shut off so that we're not doing any cooling unnecessarily. And muscles, if you're really cold, the muscles will be told to begin involuntarily contracting. We call that shivering. And it also helps to generate some heat. And these effects will continue until such time as the body temperature returns back to normal body temperature. Again, this is a negative feedback loop because the problem state and the solution state are opposite. In this case, the problem state was we were getting cold. The solution is do something to generate heat. Now there is one other type of feedback loop that we do encounter in physiology. It's a very rare one. We don't see it very often. Almost all feedback loops in the body are negative feedback loops like we saw here. Okay? But there are a small handful that are what are called positive feedback loops. These are very rare, and by definition, a positive feedback loop, the problem state and the solution state are the same. They're not the opposite of one another, they are the same. So let's take the example of childbirth, which is an example of a positive feedback loop. In childbirth, there are little pressure sensors, little neurons in the cervix that sense pressure, and when the baby's head starts to push down on them, they send a signal to the brain saying, there's a problem, we have pressure on the cervix. The brain sends out a message in the form of a hormone called oxytocin, and that oxytocin causes the uterus, the muscles in the uterus, to begin contracting. Well, that squeezes more on the baby and causes the baby's head to push even harder on the cervix, which means we get even more signals being sent to the brain that there is pressure on the cervix, which means we get even more oxytocin being sent to the uterus, causing even greater contractions of the uterus and more pressure of the baby's head on the cervix. So you can see this, the solution state heightens the problem state. It intensifies the problem state. So we get this very explosive feedback loop where the problem gets worse and worse and worse until the baby's head passes through the cervix, and that alleviates the pressure on the cervix and it stops the feedback loop. Again, very, very rare. We don't see these very often. Some examples include childbirth, high fever, especially in children. They can get what's called a runaway fever, and that can be deadly if it's not halted. The process of blood clotting is a positive feedback loop. You'll be glad to know. If it weren't, we wouldn't be able to clot fast enough to prevent blood loss and potentially death. Other examples include things like sexual orgasm. That's another example of a positive feedback loop. Okay, enough on that. Next up, we're going to have some fun and look at anatomical positions and terms.